Welcome to Natu Reads, an audio library of revolutionary texts. Interview with Chairman Gonzalo. Conducted by El Diario. Part 3. People's War. El Diario. Chairman, let's talk about the People's War now. What does violence mean to you, Chairman Gonzalo? Chairman Gonzalo. With regard to violence, we start from the principle established by Chairman Mao Zedong. Violence, that is, the need for revolutionary violence, is a universal law with no exception. Revolutionary violence is what allows us to resolve fundamental contradictions by means of an army through People's War. Why do we start from Chairman Mao's thesis? Because we believe Mao reaffirmed Marxism on this question, establishing that there are no exceptions whatsoever to this law. What Marx held, that violence is the midwife of history, continues to be a totally valid and monumental contribution. Lenin expounded upon violence and spoke about Engels' panegyric praise of revolutionary violence, but it was the chairman who told us that it was a universal law, without any exception. That is why we take his thesis as our starting point. This is an essential question of Marxism, because without revolutionary violence, one class cannot replace another, an old order cannot be overthrown to create a new one. Today, a new order led by the proletariat through communist parties. The problem of revolutionary violence is an issue that is more and more being put on the table for discussion, and therefore, we communists and revolutionaries must reaffirm our principles. The problem of revolutionary violence is how to actually carry it out with People's War. The way we see this question is that when Chairman Mao Zedong established the theory of People's War and put it into practice, he provided the proletariat with its military line, with a military theory and practice that is universally valid, and therefore applicable everywhere in accordance with the concrete conditions. We see the problem of war this way. War has two aspects, destructive and constructive. Construction is the principal aspect. Not to see it this way undermines the revolution, weakens it. On the other hand, from the moment that people take up arms to overthrow the old order, from that moment, reaction seeks to crush, destroy, and annihilate the struggle, and it uses all the means at its disposal, including genocide. We have seen this in our country, we are seeing it now, and we will continue to see it even more until the outmoded Peruvian state is demolished. As for the so-called dirty war, I would like to simply point out that they claim that the reactionary armed forces learned this dirty war from us. This accusation clearly expresses a lack of understanding of revolution and of what a people's war is. Reaction, through its armed forces and other repressive forces, seeks to carry out their objective of sweeping us away, of eliminating us. Why? Because we want to do the same to them, sweep them away and eliminate them as a class. Mariátegui said that only by destroying, demolishing the old order could a new social order be brought into being. In the final analysis, we judge these problems in light of the basic principle of war established by Chairman Mao, the principle of annihilating the enemy's forces and preserving one's own forces. We know very well that reaction has used, is using, and will continue to use genocide. On this, we are absolutely clear. And consequently, this raises the problem of the price we have to pay. In order to annihilate the enemy, and to preserve our own forces, and even more to develop them, we have to pay a price in war, a price in blood, the need to sacrifice a part for the triumph of the People's War. As for terrorism, they claim we're terrorists. I would like to give the following answer so that everyone can think about it. Has it or has it not been Yankee imperialism, and particularly Reagan, who has branded all revolutionary movements as terrorists? Yes or no? This is how they attempt to discredit and isolate us in order to crush us. That is their dream. And it's not only Yankee imperialism and the other imperialist powers that combat so-called terrorism. So does social imperialism and revisionism. And today, Gorbachev himself proposes to unite with the struggle against terrorism. And it isn't by chance that at the 8th Congress of the Party of Labor of Albania, Ramiz Alia dedicated himself to combating terrorism as well. But it will be very useful if we all remember what Lenin wrote. Quote, "Long live the pioneers of the People's Revolutionary Army. It is no longer a plot against some detested individual, no act of vengeance or desperation, no mere intimidation. No, it was a well thought out and well prepared commencement of operations by a contingent of the Revolutionary Army." End quote. Quote, "Fortunately, the time has passed when revolution was made by individual terrorists, because people were not revolutionary. The bomb has ceased to be the weapon of the solitary bomb thrower and is becoming an essential weapon of the people." End quote. Lenin taught us that times have changed, that the bomb had become the weapon of combat for our class, for the people, that what we're talking about is no longer a conspiracy, an isolated individual act, but the actions of a party with a plan, with a system, with an army. So, where is the imputed terrorism? It's pure slander. Finally, we always have to remember that, especially in present-day war, it is precisely the reactionaries who use terrorism as one of their means of struggle, and it is, as has been proven repeatedly, one of the forms used on a daily basis by the armed forces of the Peruvian state. Considering all this, we can conclude that those whose reasoning is colored by desperation, because the earth is trembling beneath their feet, wish to charge us with terrorism in order to hide the people's war. But this people's war is so earth-shaking that they themselves admit that it is of national dimensions, and that it has become the principal problem facing the Peruvian state. What terrorism could do that? None. And moreover, they can no longer deny that a Communist Party is leading the people's war. And at this time, some of them are beginning to reconsider. We shouldn't be too hasty in writing anyone off. There are those who could come forward. Others, like Del Prado, never. El Diario. What are some of the particularities of the People's War in Peru? And how does it differ from other struggles in the world, in Latin America, and from the Movimiento Revolucionario Tupac Amaru, MRTA? Chairman Gonzalo. That's a good question. I thank you for asking it, because it gives us a chance to look at the party's so-called dogmatism a bit more. There are even those who say that we incorrectly try to apply Chairman Mao in an era where he is no longer applicable. In short, they babble on so much that we feel perfectly justified asking whether they have any idea what they are talking about. This includes the much decorated senator who is a specialist in violence. People's War is universally applicable, in accordance with the character of the revolution and adapted to the specific conditions of each country. Otherwise, it cannot be carried out. In our case, the particularities are very clear. It is a struggle that is waged in the countryside and in the city, as was established as far back as 1968 in the Plan for the People's War. Here we have a difference, a particularity. It is waged in the countryside and the city. This, we believe, has to do with our own specific conditions. Latin America, for instance, has cities which are proportionally larger than those on other continents. It is a reality of Latin America that can't be ignored. Just look at the capital of Peru, for example, which has a high percentage of the country's population. So, for us, the city could not be left aside, and the war had to be developed there as well. But the struggle in the countryside is principal, the struggle in the city a necessary complement. This is one particularity. There's another. In the beginning of the People's War, we confronted the police. That was the reality because only in December 1982 did the armed forces enter the war. This is not to say that they had not been used in a support role before then. They had, in addition to their studying the process of our development. It is a particularity because we created a power vacuum in the countryside, and we had to establish the new power without having defeated large armed forces, because they hadn't come into the war. And when they did, when they came in, it was because we had established people's power. That was the concrete political situation in the country. If we had applied the letter and not the spirit of Mao, we would not have established the new power, and we would have been sitting, waiting for the armed forces to come in. We would have gotten bogged down. Another particularity was the structure of the army, which I've already talked about. All these are particularities. We have already spoken to the countryside and the city, to how we carry out the war, to the army, to how the new power arose. And the militarization of the party itself is another particularity. These are specific things that correspond to our reality, to the application of Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, of Chairman Mao's theory on people's war, to the conditions in our country. Does this make us different from the other struggles? Yes. Why do we differ from others? Because we carry out people's war. This makes us different from other struggles in Latin America. In Cuba, people's war was not carried out, but they also had their own particularities, which they have intentionally forgotten. Before, they said Cuba was an exceptional case. Guevara said this. The fact that US imperialism didn't take part. Later, they forgot this. Aside from this, there was no Communist Party there to give leadership. These are questions of Cubanism and its 5 characteristics. An insufficient class differentiation, which demanded that saviors save the oppressed. Socialist revolution, or a caricature of revolution. United front, but without the national bourgeoisie. No need for base areas. And, as noted, no need for a party. What we are seeing in Latin America today is just the development of these same positions, only more and more at the service of social imperialism and its contention with Yankee imperialism for world hegemony. We can see this clearly in Central America. The MRTA, the little that we know of it, falls into the same category. Finally, another issue that makes us different, and forgive me if I'm insistent, concerns independence, self-reliance, and making our own decisions. Because others do not have these characteristics, they are used as pawns while we are not. And one far-reaching difference. We take Marxism-Leninism-Maoism as our guide, others do not. In sum, the greatest difference, the fundamental difference, is in the point of departure. Ours is the ideology of Marxism-Leninism-Maoism, principally Maoism, applied to the specific conditions of our country, and I insist here again that this is with clear particularities, which show the falsehood of the so-called dogmatism they accuse us of, which they do at the behest of their masters. El Diario. Chairman, would you say then that the MRTA is playing a counter-revolutionary role in this country? Chairman Gonzalo. The MRTA has positions that should make one think. For example, the truce they granted to APRA until, as they said, APRA attacked the people. But we all know that the same day that Garcia Perez assumed the presidency, he repressed the masses in the very capital of the Republic. In October 1985, there was a genocide at Lurigancho prison. Were the people being attacked or not? And how long did they wait to put an end to their truce? These are things one must ask oneself. El Diario. Since you consider the base areas to be so important, could you tell us how they are being built? What do you think about insurrection, and how are you preparing the cities? Chairman Gonzalo. The base area is the essence of people's war. Without it, people's war cannot develop. I have already talked about the specific circumstances that we confronted in the second half of 1982. We were developing the final stage of the campaign to unfold guerrilla warfare, aimed at destroying the semi-feudal relations of exploitation. We took aim against comunalismo, the semi-feudal relations in the Peruvian countryside, which is the basis of state power, and will be until we sweep it away. We continued to strike blows, and we dealt the police devastating and humiliating defeats. You don't have to take my word on this. Journalists from Expresso, for example, have said this, and I think it's safe to say that their judgment was not colored by revolutionary sympathies. Thus, having generated a power vacuum in the countryside, the problem was posed to us. What is to be done? And we decided to create people's committees. That is, a joint dictatorship, a new power. We set out to make them clandestine, because the armed forces would have to enter the battle shortly. This we knew. Those people's committees have multiplied 100-fold. Those that are in a given locality form a base area, and all these base areas, taken together, constitute the new Democratic People's Republic in formation. This is how the committees and base areas came into being, and how the new Democratic People's Republic is being formed. When the armed forces did come in, we had to wage an arduous struggle. They fought to reestablish the old order, and we fought to counter this reestablishment in order to again set up the new power. An extremely bloody and absolutely merciless genocide took place. We fought fiercely. In 1984, reaction, and in particular the armed forces, believed they had defeated us. Here I'm referring to documents that they are very familiar with, because they are theirs, in which it was even said that we were no longer a danger, but that MRTA was the danger. But what was the outcome? The people's committees in the base areas multiplied, and later that led us to continue the development of base areas. That is what we are doing today. As for insurrection, I believe this is an extremely important question. The developing revolutionary situation in a country like ours allowed us to initiate the People's War, having already reconstituted the party and established a clear ideology. The actual development of the base areas, the development of the People's Guerrilla Army and of the People's War, are giving impetus to the further unfolding of the revolutionary situation. Thus, keeping in mind what Chairman Mao has said, all of this is leading to what he called a high tide of struggle, or what Lenin termed a revolutionary crisis. When we reach that point, the insurrection takes place. This is the theory of People's War, and this is what we are taking up, and the basis upon which we are developing. Therefore, because the process of our People's War must bring us to a high tide, we must prepare the insurrection that, in synthesis, comes down to the seizure of the cities. We are thinking about and preparing for this insurrection, because it is a necessity. Without it, we cannot win countrywide victory. What does the problem of the cities pose for us? We have developed our work in the cities and in the countryside for many years. This work has undergone a shift and a change with the People's War, it is true. Our situation now leads us to consider how we are going to prepare the city, or the cities, to generalize it. This has to do with developing our mass work, but within and for the People's War. We have done this, and we continue to do it. The point is that we have begun to develop it more. We think that our activity in the cities is indispensable, and it must be pushed forward more and more, because that is where the proletariat is concentrated, and we cannot leave it in the hands of revisionism or opportunism. The slums are in the cities, the shanty towns with their vast masses. Since 1976, we've had guidelines for work in the cities. Take barrios and slums as the foundation and the proletariat as the leading force. This is our policy, and we will continue to apply it now under conditions of People's War. What masses do we direct our work at? This you can see. From what's already been said, it's clear that the vast masses of the barrios and slums are a belt of steel that is going to encircle the enemy and hold back the reactionary forces. We have to win over the working class more and more until they and the people acknowledge our leadership. We fully understand that it will take time and repeated experience in order for our class to see, understand, and reaffirm that this is their vanguard. for the people to see that they have a center that leads them. They have that right, given how much the masses have been swindled. The proletariat, the masses of the slums, the petty bourgeoisie, the intellectuals, how many hopes frustrated. We must understand that they have the right to demand it. Clearly they have it, and we have the responsibility to work to make them see, to show them that we really are their vanguard, and that they should acknowledge us as such. We differentiate between being a vanguard and being an acknowledged vanguard. Our class has that right, and no one can deny it to them. The people have that right, and no one can deny it to them. That's what we think. We don't think that the proletariat and the people are going to acknowledge us overnight as their vanguard and only center, which is what we have to be in order to carry out the revolution as it must be carried out. So we have to persevere and develop different forms as an integral part of our mass work. Different forms so that the masses learn from the People's War itself, so that they learn the value of weapons, the importance of the gun. Chairman Mao says that the peasantry must learn the importance of the gun. This is a fact. So we do our work in this way. We create new forms, and in this way, we unfold our mass work within and for the People's War. This is related to something else, to the revolutionary movement in defense of the people, whose very key is the center of resistance. We say this very frankly. These are other organizational forms, other forms of struggle which correspond to a people's war. They cannot be the usual ones. They cannot be. They have a different character. This is the concrete reality. Consequently, we develop the party, the People's Guerrilla Army, and the revolutionary movement in defense of the people, as well as organizations created for the various areas of work. We need to spur on the masses' fighting spirit so that the potential of the masses and our class can be realized. Let's look at something. Today, we have huge price increases. Why is there no popular protest? Who is holding the masses back? Lenin said protest makes reaction tremble. When our class marches in the streets, reaction trembles. This is what we want to apply, what Marxism-Leninism-Maoism teaches us. Our class is born and develops in struggle, and so do the people. What we need to do is synthesize the masses, the people's own experience, to help them establish their own organizational forms of struggle, taking into their own hands ever more developed and expanding forms of struggle in the cities. This is the way they will be trained. What do we think? It is clear that the center of things is in the countryside. But for the insurrection, the center changes. The center goes over to the city, and that even means that, just as in the beginning we moved fighters and communists from the cities to the countryside, later we must move them from the countryside to the city. This is the way it will be, and this is how we shift our weight in preparation for the insurrection. We have to be looking for the conditions that permit the actions of the People's Guerrilla Army to converge with insurrectionary actions in the cities, in one city or in several. This is what we need. The insurrection aims at capturing the cities in order for the People's War to win countrywide victory. But we have to try to preserve the means of production, which reaction will want to destroy, and protect revolutionary prisoners of war or known revolutionaries, who they will want to annihilate, as well as to hunt down our enemies, to put them where they can't do any harm. This is what we've been taught about insurrection, and this is what an insurrection is. Lenin taught us how to build towards an insurrection, and Chairman Mao taught us the role of insurrection in People's War. This is how we see insurrection and how we are preparing for it. This is the road we must follow and are following. We must be very clear on one thing. Insurrection is not a simple, spontaneous explosion. No, that would be dangerous. Nevertheless, this could happen, and that's why we must and do concern ourselves with insurrection starting right now. We think there are those who might want to use the People's War for their own benefit. Some time ago, in a session of the Central Committee, we analyzed the possibilities, and one of them is that the revisionists or others may provoke insurrections, either to abort the process of development, or to gain positions and serve their social imperialist master, or whatever power directs them, since many centers could want to use us this way. El Diario. Chairman, what would the party do in those circumstances? Chairman Gonzalo. In those circumstances, we would do what Lenin did. Tell the masses that this is not the moment, but if the masses launch an insurrection, fight alongside them, so that together we can make an orderly retreat, and so that they suffer as little as possible. And, if we die with them, our blood will be merged with theirs to a greater extent. This is what Lenin taught us in the famous struggles of July 1917. Because we cannot just tell the masses they are wrong, and let events make them understand. No, we can't do that. The masses are the masses, our class is our class, and if they are not heading in the right direction, and the conditions make them desperate and push them into situations, or even if there are those who push them on purpose, we have to be with them, so that alongside them, we can help them see the unfavorable situation, and, fighting alongside them, help them retreat in the best way possible. And then they will see that we are with them through thick and thin. This is the best way for them to understand and be convinced that we are their party. This is what we would do. El Diario. Chairman, another question. When you speak of the forms of struggle in the city, what role do you ascribe to the unions? Chairman Gonzalo. The same one Marx ascribed to them in the past, present, and future of the trade unions. 100 years ago, Marx said that the trade unions began as simple associations for the economic defense of the workers. That is their past. Their present is to become more organized and to develop politically, and their future is to serve the seizure of power. This Marx has already told us. So then, what is the problem? How to combine the two struggles. The economic struggle is, as Marx himself said, a guerrilla war, the struggle that our class, the proletariat, and the people develop for wages, hours, working conditions, and other rights. When a strike is launched, it is a guerrilla war in which people not only fight around concrete economic or political questions, if it is one of general interest, but also prepare for great moments to come. And this is its fundamental historic essence. So the question for us is how to relate the economic struggle to the seizure of power. This is what we call developing our mass work within and for the People's War. El Diario. Chairman, you spoke of the revolutionary crisis. Do you believe it's on the horizon in the short term? Chairman Gonzalo. The issue is the triumph of the People's War, and this has to do, mainly, with how much more and how much better we fight. And the insurrection, as I've already said, is the knockout punch we must prepare to deliver, and we're seriously preparing to deliver it. We have to anticipate the possibility that others may wish to use it to their advantage. But the main problem is the timing of the insurrection, determining the opportune moment. El Diario. Why did the Communist Party of Peru initiate the People's War in 1980? What is the military and historical explanation for this? What social, economic, and political analysis did the PCP carry out in order to launch the war? Chairman Gonzalo. We studied the country, particularly from World War II on, and we saw that in its process of development, Peruvian society was entering a complex situation. The government's own analysis showed that critical questions would present themselves in the 80s. In Peru, it can be seen that there is a crisis every 10 years in the second half of the decade, and each crisis is worse than the one before. We also analyzed bureaucrat capitalism, which makes conditions more ripe for revolution. In 1980, the government was to change hands through elections, which meant that the new government would need 1.5 to 2 years to fully put in place the operations of its state. So, we concluded that bureaucrat capitalism had ripened the conditions for revolution, and that the difficult decade of the 80s approached, with crisis, an elected government, etc. All this provided a very favorable conjuncture for initiating the People's War, and refuted the position that armed struggle, or in our case People's War, cannot be initiated when there is a new government. events have demonstrated the incorrectness of that position. Such was our evaluation, and such was the situation as the new government took over, that the military, having left the government after ruling for 12 years, could not easily take up the struggle against us right away, nor could they immediately take the helm of state again, because they were worn down and had become discredited. These were the concrete facts, the reality. Prior to that time, we had already put forward that participation in the Constituent Assembly was incorrect, that the only thing to do was to boycott it, because to participate in the Constituent Assembly was simply to serve the restructuring of the Peruvian state, and to produce a constitution like the one we have. All this was foreseeable. There was nothing that could not be foreseen in this case. Therefore, we had planned for some time to lay the basis to initiate the People's War, to make our move before the new government took office, which is what we did. We began the armed struggle on May 17, the day before the elections. We thought that under these conditions, we could initiate our actions, and even unfold them broadly and advance to the greatest extent possible, and that is exactly what we did. We were also thinking that in the second part of the decade, there would have to be a more serious crisis than the previous one, and, therefore, better conditions for advancing. The initiation of the People's War was planned based on these considerations. But it's been said that we didn't think, but only acted dogmatically. In what way? Some people preach about dogma while swallowing anything that they're told. For these reasons, we chose that moment, and the correctness of our decision has been borne out by events. It was obvious that Belaunde, and this is something we discussed openly, would fear a coup d'etat, and therefore would restrain the armed forces. Was that difficult to foresee? No, because of the experience he had in 1968. These things could be calculated, and we've been taught to evaluate, analyze, and weigh things. That's how we've been taught. The chairman was very exacting with regard to these problems, especially in regard to preparation. We believe that events have confirmed our analysis. For 2 years, the armed forces could not come in. Was that the case or not? Now they are saying that they burned the intelligence information that they had. In short, the new government had problems setting up its administration, and the facts have shown that. Then came the crisis. The military had entered the battle with ever larger contingents, and in fighting them for a number of years, we are more powerful. We continue to flourish and develop. These were the reasons for initiating the People's War in 1980, and the facts show that we were not wrong, at least not in the broad outlines, which is where one must not be wrong. El Diario. Taking into account that there are 2 strategies in conflict in this war, could you explain the process of development of your military plans, advances, and what problems you've had? Chairman Gonzalo. Our starting point is this. Each class has its own specific form of war, and therefore its own strategy. The proletariat has developed its strategy, People's War, and it is a superior strategy. The bourgeoisie can never have a strategy superior to this. Moreover, there will never be a strategy more developed than that of the proletariat. It is a question of studying military processes in the world. Each class has always brought forth its own form of waging war and its own strategy, and always, the superior strategy has defeated the inferior strategy, and the new class always has the superior strategy, and that's what People's War is. There's evidence to prove this. There are military analysts who put it like this. Communists, when they have applied their principles, have never lost a war. They have only lost wars when they have not applied their principles. Therefore, our starting point was that we have a superior strategy, a universally proven theory. Our problem was how to wield it to make a revolution. Therein lies the problem, and the possibility of making errors. The first thing that we established was the need to avoid a mechanical application of People's War, because Chairman Mao Zedong warned us that a mechanical application leads to opportunism and defeat. In 1980, which is when we decided to begin the People's War, we decided in the party central committee to pay strict attention to developing a concrete application, not a dogmatic or a mechanical one. This is how we formulated it. This was our starting point. Well, here we can point out the first problem that we had. The first problem that we had was an antagonistic struggle against a right opportunist line that was opposed to starting the People's War. This is the first problem that we had. We settled this question fundamentally in the 9th plenum, and the remnants were swept away completely in the February 1980 plenum. That was the first problem we had, and from there, we had the struggle to purify the party that we talked about before. And we had to struggle fiercely to weed out elements from the Central Committee itself. That's the way it is, but that is how we strengthened ourselves and how we were able to enter the process of initiating the People's War. We already had a plan for waging war in the countryside and the city. The first plan that we proposed was the plan to initiate. The Political Bureau was asked to determine how to develop armed actions, and it was this body that presented the plan, based on detachments as the military form. This plan was brought to its conclusion in 1980, but it's important to note that 2 weeks after initiating the armed struggle, there was a meeting of the expanded Political Bureau in order to analyze how it had gone, and it concluded that a new thing had been born, and this was the People's War, armed actions, detachments. Then, we developed the plan to unfold. This was a longer plan, comprising 2 years, but it was fulfilled through several campaigns. It was at the end of this plan that the new forms of power crystallized and the People's Committees arose. At the end of 1982, the armed forces came in. The Central Committee had anticipated this for more than a year. It had studied the involvement of the armed forces and concluded that it would increase until the army had substituted for the police, who would then assume a secondary role. This is how it has been, and given the situation, it could not have been otherwise. We had prepared ourselves, but nevertheless, we had a second problem. The introduction of the armed forces had its consequences. They came in applying a policy of genocide from the very beginning. They formed armed groups, called mehnadas, forcing the masses to join and putting them in front, using them as shields. This must be said clearly. Here, we see not only the policy of using masses against masses, an old reactionary policy already seen by Marx, but also a cowardly use of the masses, putting the masses in front of them. The armed forces have done nothing to boast about. With good reason, we have called them experts at defeat and skilled at attacking the unarmed masses. These are the armed forces of Peru. Faced with this, we convened an expanded session of the CC. It was a large meeting, and it lasted a long time. It was one of the longest sessions we've ever had. That's when we established the plan to conquer base areas, and the People's Guerrilla Army was created to respond to a force that was obviously of a higher level than the police. It was there that we also raised, among other things, the problem of the front/state. Thus arose the second problem, the problem of confronting the genocide of 1983 and 1984. It is in the party documents. It's not necessary to go into it a lot, but we do want to stress the fact that it was a vicious and merciless genocide. They thought that with this genocide, quote, they would wipe us off the map, end quote. How real this was is shown by the fact that, by the end of 1984, they began to circulate among their officers documents concerning our annihilation. The struggle was intense, hard. Those were complex and difficult times. In the face of reactionary military actions and the use of mehnadas, we responded with a devastating action, lucha na marca. Neither they nor we have forgotten it, to be sure, because they got an answer that they didn't imagine possible. More than 80 were annihilated, that is the truth. And we say openly that there were excesses, as was analyzed in 1983. But everything in life has two aspects. Our task was to deal a devastating blow in order to put them in check, to make them understand that it was not going to be so easy. On some occasions, like that one, it was the central leadership itself that planned the action and gave instructions. That is how it was. In that case, the principal thing is that we dealt them a devastating blow, and we checked them, and they understood that they were dealing with a different kind of people's fighters, that we weren't the same as those they had fought before. This is what they understood. The excesses are the negative aspect. Understanding war and basing ourselves on what Lenin said, taking Clausewitz into account, in war, the masses engaged in combat can go too far and express all their hatred, the deep feelings of class hatred, repudiation, and condemnation that they have. That was the root of it. This has been explained by Lenin very clearly. Excesses can be committed. The problem is to go to a certain point and not beyond it, because if you go past that point, you go off course. It's like an angle. It can be opened up to a certain point and no further. If we were to give the masses a lot of restrictions, requirements, and prohibitions, it would mean that deep down, we didn't want the waters to overflow. And what we needed was for the waters to overflow, to let the flood rage, because we know that when a river floods its banks, it causes devastation, but then it returns to its riverbed. I repeat, this was explained clearly by Lenin, and this is how we understand those excesses. But I insist, the main point was to make them understand that we were a hard nut to crack, and that we were ready for anything. Marx taught us, one does not play at insurrection, one does not play at revolution. But when one raises the banner of insurrection, when one takes up arms, there is no taking down the banner. It must be held high and never lowered until victory. This is what he taught us, no matter how much it costs us. Marx has armed us then, as Lenin has, and, principally, Chairman Mao Zedong taught us about the price we have to pay, what it means to annihilate in order to preserve, and what it means to hold high the banner, come what may. And we say that, in this way, with this determination, we overcame this sinister, vile, cowardly, and vicious genocide. And we say this because someone, he who calls himself president, makes insinuations about barbarism, without blushing when he is an aspiring Attila the Hun playing with other people's blood. Have we gone through difficult times? Yes. But what has reality shown us? That if we persist, keep politics in command, follow our political strategy, follow our military strategy, if we have a clear and defined plan, then we will advance, and we are capable of facing any bloodbath. We began to prepare for the bloodbath in 1981 because it had to come. Thus, we were already prepared ideologically, that is principle. All this brought about an increase in our forces. They multiplied. This was the result. It turned out as the chairman had said. Reaction is dreaming when it tries to drown the revolution in blood. They should know they are nourishing it, and this is an inexorable law. So this reaffirms for us that we have to be more and more dedicated, firm, and resolute in our principles, and always have unwavering faith in the masses. Thus we came out of it strengthened, with a larger army, more people's committees in base areas, and a larger party, exactly the opposite of what they had imagined. We have already talked, I believe, of the bloody dreams of reaction. They are nothing but that, bloody dreams that, in the final analysis, end up being nightmares. But I insist, by persisting in our principles and fighting with the support of the masses, mainly the poor peasants, we've been able to confront this situation. It is here that the heroism of which I have already spoken, the heroism of the masses, has been expressed. Subsequently, we developed a new plan, the plan to develop the base areas which we are unfolding now. What can we say about it? Looking at another aspect, I believe that we must keep a lesson in mind. All plans are approved, applied, and summed up in the midst of a two-line struggle. And that struggle is more intense when a new plan has to be approved. That's the reality. It's a lesson that we keep very much in mind. It has been very instructive for us and taught us a lot. That's the way it is. In the end, People's War generates an extremely high degree of unity, but amid intense struggle. Yes, because in spite of the problems, the complex and difficult situations we face, in spite of external influences, the ideological dynamic is that those who are engaged in People's War have given their lives over to the revolution. A communist has his life dedicated to communism, although he will not see it, because really, we aren't going to see it. At least I am not going to see it. But that's not the problem. Not seeing the goal for which we struggle only leads us to reflect, to take hold of the great examples that Marxism has given us. In Marx's time, he knew that he would not see the triumph of the revolution. And where did that lead him? To redoubling his efforts to advance the revolution. Those are lessons we've drawn, and we've been guided by those tremendous examples. Let me insist once again. This is not to imply any comparison, it is only to fix on the pole star, to set the course as a guide. Well, if we think about the armed struggle and People's War, we can say that the initiation allowed us to develop the guerrilla war, because in this period, we went over from detachments to platoons, and in this way, we extended guerrilla warfare. The plan to unfold gave us the People's Committees. The plan to conquer base areas gave us the base areas and a broad zone of operations. We should remember that we conceived of the highlands as the backbone for developing the war and conquering power throughout the country. Yes, the Sierra of our country, and we've covered an area that goes from one border to another, from Ecuador to Bolivia and Chile. But we've also developed work in the eyebrow of the jungle, where the Sierra meets the jungle, and the mountainous areas leading down to the coast and the cities as well. Today, we can say that we have hundreds of People's Committees in numerous base areas. Of course, there is a principal one, and each zone has its principal one as well. Finally, we could say of the plans that we've learned how to direct the war with a single strategic plan, applying the principle of centralized strategy and decentralized tactics. We direct the war by means of a single plan with different parts, through campaigns, with strategic operative plans, tactical plans, and concrete plans for each action. But the key to all this is the single strategic plan, which allows us to direct the war in a unified way, and that is key in leading a people's war. I think that is what I have to say about it. El Diario. Chairman, in these 8 years of People's War, what has the anti-subversive strategy accomplished, and what are its present problems? Chairman Gonzalo. It is a question that I would prefer to answer in this way. The reactionaries themselves say they've failed, and continue failing, they know this well. To use a lawyer's saying, quote, when someone confesses, no more proof is needed, end quote. El Diario. When do you think the conditions will exist for the People's Guerrilla Army to develop conventional war, defend territorial positions, and openly confront the armed forces? Is this kind of struggle in the PCP's plans? Chairman Gonzalo. We've pondered these problems, discussed them, and established party policy. We've dealt with this in 1981. We've also done so on other occasions. We've started from how Chairman Mao Zedong conceived of People's War, starting from contradictions. There are two aspects in contention. One is weak, and the other is temporarily strong. There needs to transpire a period of strategic defensive, a second one of strategic equilibrium, and a third one of strategic offensive. We are still developing within the strategic defensive, and in these conditions, guerrilla war continues to be our principal form, a generalized guerrilla war, waged broadly, both in the countryside and the city, with the countryside being principal and the city complementary. And we are fighting in almost the entire country. This is in regard to the period we are in. We are beginning to develop mobile warfare, as conceived of by Chairman Mao, and will develop it further in accordance with the fact that reaction will necessarily have to wage a more developed counterinsurgency war. But even as this happens, we will have to continue waging guerrilla war as principal, and mobile warfare as complementary, and, within that, some specific kinds of positional warfare as talked about in On Protracted War. I think that an intensification of the People's War must also produce an escalation of the counterinsurgency war, and this is going to be based on genocide. Looking ahead, this is going to lead to the stage of strategic equilibrium, with the understanding, of course, that we persist in a correct ideological and political line, and therefore maintain a correct military line, which we have to do. So, strategic equilibrium will result from our persisting in all this, coupled with the sinister plans that they are preparing, that will lead to genocide, which they want to impose upon the Peruvian people because they feel powerless. But the people cannot follow them, because the people cannot go against their own class interests. This will lead to strategic equilibrium, let me repeat, with the understanding that we maintain the correct course in ideology, politics, in military, and all related matters. It's at that point that we'll have to address the problem of how to develop People's War, to take the cities and prepare the part that corresponds to the strategic offensive. That's all we can say for now. El Diario. To strengthen the war, as you said, is it going to be necessary to strengthen the weaponry of the People's Guerrilla Army? How do you intend to resolve this? Chairman Gonzalo. Yes, this is one aspect. Allow me to take a question of principle as my starting point. We are accustomed to and persist in taking our principles as our starting point. In this way, guided by our principles, we can solve our concrete problems. Chairman Mao Zedong has told us that the main thing is man. Weapons are useful, so our task is to aim especially at people, at strengthening them ideologically and politically, at building the army ideologically and politically in this case, as well as building it militarily. This is our point of departure. With regard to weapons, the chairman says that the enemy has them, and so the problem is to seize them from him, and this is principle. Modern weapons are necessary, but their performance depends on the ideology of the man who wields them. Lenin taught us that. We can assert that we are carrying out ambushes, and the armed forces know very well how this is developing and the powerful blows they've been dealt. I'd only like to mention the one related to Callao, the ambush of Erujo. 25 soldiers were annihilated. Only one survived, and he was wounded. That is why they've responded with vicious genocide. The facts are not as they've portrayed them. The truth is that they've moved large forces and were not able to hunt us down. And let's be clear also that we seized their arms. They know this very well. And we didn't blow up just one car, but two, because a whole kilometer of the road was mined, and they had no way to escape. What was shown on television and in the newspapers by he who calls himself president, and those who've gone to Callao from the so-called commission are, as they say, quote, castles in the air, end quote, drawings in the water, end quote. So it has been some time since the growing transfer of arms from them to us began. And they are obligated to bring them to us. It is their obligation to bring them to where we are. And we have to recognize that they've begun to do so. Why do we put things this way? Because we've forced them to spread out, to open different fronts, and have made them sit and wait passively. They're like an elephant stuck in the mud, and therefore easier to attack. This is something the army and the armed forces in general must seriously think about. What I am talking about is none other than the application of what Chairman Mao Zedong taught us when he said that Chiang Kai-shek, by the end of the war, deserved a medal because he acted as a good quartermaster, a good arms supplier. So that has already started, and the armed forces know it very well. And the plan they are cooking up, all their scheming, the great offensive they want to carry out, is all welcome. It will not hinder the transfer of arms, and they will fail, because they will not succeed in getting the Peruvian people to go against their own interests. And they are the blackest, most rotten of reactionaries, led today by this fascist, corporatist aprista government headed by a vile and miserable mass murderer. History has shown that the Peruvian people do not follow fascism, and will not allow themselves to be corporatized. That has already been established, and this is not just an issue in Peru today, but has been one for decades. So the enemy's weapons, which we seize from them, are our principal source. Furthermore, humble dynamite will continue playing an important role, and mines are weapons of the people. As for us, our principle is to look for the simplest weapons that everyone from among the masses can wield, because our war is a war of the masses. Otherwise, it would not be a people's war, and ours is. This leads to a second question, the manufacturing of weapons. We are striving to advance in the manufacture of arms, which the other side also knows very well by now. Direct notice of this was given to the presidential palace, launched with mortars made by our own hands, by the hands of the people. They don't say so, but we know. The other common way is to buy them, because there are three ways. The main one is to seize them from the enemy, the second one is to manufacture them, and the third one is to buy them. The last one is a problem because of the high cost of weapons, and we are carrying out the most economical people's war on Earth. It's that way because we have very few resources, and those that we do have are those that the masses provide us with. To reiterate one more time, how is the problem solved? Lenin said that large quantities of arms must be seized, at whatever cost. And I have already talked about what Chairman Mao taught us. This is what we are putting into practice. El Diario. Can you foresee that the triumph and advance of the revolution that you are leading will provoke a U.S. military invasion? What would the PCP do in that case? Chairman Gonzalo. Although Yankee imperialism is already intervening, on this question, I would concretely say the following. The United States can mobilize our neighboring countries. We should not forget, I insist, that there are even pending territorial claims and border disputes, even though they are silent on this, and we all know the role that Brazil has been assigned. They could intervene directly with their own troops. They already have people training here. Some time ago, we decided in the Central Committee that whatever enemy comes to trample on this land, we will confront him and defeat him. In those circumstances, the contradiction would change. The oppressed nation imperialist contradiction would become principle, and that would give us an even broader basis on which to unite our people. El Diario. Reactionaries, revisionists, and opportunists of the IU all say that you are isolated from the masses. What can you say about that? Chairman Gonzalo. I believe that from everything we are saying, it can be seen that there is support from the masses. To those who say such things, to the revisionists and opportunists, we would ask, how can they explain the existence of a movement that has developed a people's war for 8 years without international aid if it does not have the support of the masses? El Diario. For 8 years, the groups and parties of the right, the revisionists, the opportunists, and all the reactionaries have said and even screamed that the PCP is a demented, messianic, bloodthirsty, Pol Potian, dogmatic, sectarian, narco-terrorist organization. The Partido Unificado Mariateguista, PUM, adds that you have trapped the peasantry in the middle, between two fires, that you are militarists. Recently, Villanueva, an APRA official, has said that you are genocidal terrorists and other things. What do you have to say about these charges? What's behind them? Chairman Gonzalo. To me, they represent lies and the inability to understand people's war. And I understand that. The enemies of the revolution will never be able to understand people's war. With respect to the charge that the peasantry is caught between two fires, this is an elaborate invention, because it is precisely the peasantry that makes up the vast majority of the people's guerrilla army. What must be understood is that the Peruvian state, with its armed forces and repressive apparatus, wants to drown the revolution in blood. This is our understanding, and we would recommend that these gentlemen study a little bit about warfare in general, revolutionary war, and mainly about people's war and Maoism. Although I doubt that they would understand it, because to do so requires a certain class stand. With regard to what Mr. Villanueva says about genocidal terrorists, it seems to me an obscene travesty and parody to want to apply to us a term like genocidal, which fits them like a glove. Before our country and the world, it is perfectly clear who is committing genocide. It is they. It is the APRA government which is leading this reactionary state. It is the reactionary armed forces, the forces of repression. They are the vile mass murderers. Distortions will never change the facts. History has already been written. Tomorrow it will be confirmed. Besides, how long will Villanueva last? What will his future be like? It would be better if he thought about that. El Diario. What changes do you think have taken place in Peruvian politics, in the economic base of society, and among the masses as a result of 8 years of People's War? Chairman Gonzalo. The first change is the development of a People's War that is advancing irrepressibly, which means that, for the first time, the democratic revolution is really being carried out in our country. This has changed all the terms of Peruvian politics. Hence, reaction itself, their accomplices, beginning with the revisionists and their supporters on duty, whoever they may be, have concluded that the first and main problem facing the Peruvian state is the People's War. Thus, we are changing the world in this country. Out of this comes the most important and principal thing we've accomplished, the emergence and development of a new power, which marches forward and will end up extending itself throughout the country. In the economic base, under the new power, we are establishing new relations of production. A concrete example of this is how we apply the land policy, utilizing collective work, and the organization of social life according to a new reality, with a joint dictatorship where, for the first time, those who rule are workers, peasants, and progressives, understanding this to mean those who want to transform this country by the only means possible, People's War. As for them, the reactionaries, without mentioning the economic drain of fighting the People's War, we are destroying bureaucrat capitalism, and, for some time, we've been undermining the gamonal basis for the semi-feudal relations that sustain this whole structure, while at the same time striking strong blows against imperialism. For the masses of our people, those heroic masses, principally for the proletariat, the leading class that we will always recognize, for the first time, they are taking power, and they have begun to taste the honey on their lips. They will not stop there. They will want it all, and they will get it. El Diario. How do you see the present situation, and the prospects for the People's War in Peru? What destiny awaits the Peruvian people if the revolution that you've been leading for more than 8 years doesn't triumph in the short run? Do you believe that this government or another one can find a way out of this crisis? In the document Basis for Discussion, the PCP indicated that we are entering decisive years, in which APRA continues to be without a strategic plan. Could it be that we are on the threshold of the victory of the revolution and of the seizure of state power by the PCP? Chairman Gonzalo. The Peruvian people are increasingly mobilizing themselves, and the class struggle is sharpening. This is directly linked to the People's War, which is nothing but the continuation of the class struggle with arms in hand. What destiny awaits the Peruvian people? I believe that the heroic destiny of destroying the old state and the glorious destiny of beginning to build a new society will be a monumental effort. These will be times of sacrifice and difficulties, but the people will emerge victorious. In the end, it should be enough to reflect on this. Without the People's War, would 60,000 children under 1 year of age stop dying, as is the case in Peru today? No. Therefore, the people will continue making every effort and will go through difficulties. But each day, more consciously, they will pay the necessary price, knowing that they will win. A way out? We believe that they have no way out. Our understanding of the process of contemporary Peruvian society is that starting in 1980, bureaucrat capitalism has entered into its destruction, and as a result, the whole system is falling apart, and they have no way out. And if we look at it, there's a serious crisis. But also the 2 decades have come together back to back, the decade of the 80s and the decade of the 90s, both of them critical. They have no way out. In regard to the decisive years, we understand by decisive years a more powerful storm between People's War and counter-revolutionary war, and we believe, once again, that from this will emerge the stage of strategic equilibrium. As for time, Chairman Mao said the more and better we fight, the less time will be needed. For our part, it is our obligation to do this. We are doing it, and we will do it. On the other hand, we have extraordinary objective conditions. The conditions of general crisis, which the decrepit system of Peruvian society has entered into, reveals to us that things can accelerate in these decisive years. And in fact, these decisive years will powerfully accelerate the conditions and develop the revolutionary situation. What are our tasks today? In sum, more People's War, more new power, more army, more involvement of the masses, and this is how we believe our victory will come. El Diario. Finally, could you lay out your position with regard to worldwide People's War? In the case of a world war between the superpowers, what would be the results for humanity? Chairman Gonzalo. Could there be a world war? Yes, there could be. The conditions for this will exist as long as we do not eliminate their roots. The superpowers are obviously preparing for war and making big plans. But we believe that communists and revolutionaries, the masses, the people, those who can no longer accept so much injustice in the world, must not focus our attention on war between the superpowers, because our liberation cannot come from that, because it would be a war of plunder, for a redivision of the world. World war between the big powers is for hegemony, nothing else. What can we expect from them? Huge massacres, large-scale genocide, hundreds of thousands of deaths. But certainly the immense majority of humanity will survive. We cannot accept the sinister ideas of today that worship atomic weapons and all the sophisticated weaponry they brandish. Nor can we allow them to use them as blackmail to paralyze us. Many times in the world, the reactionaries have talked about decisive and definitive weapons and the disappearance of humanity. But it has always been to restrain and stifle people, to maintain their old domination. That's why we believe that we must focus our attention, our efforts, our passion, our will, on developing People's War, because from that will certainly come the emancipation of the people and the proletariat, the definitive and true emancipation. We think that a worldwide People's War is the answer to an imperialist world war. We think that the task is to prepare for it, and we conceive of it as follows. Those who are already waging People's War should develop it more. Those who have not initiated it should start developing it. And through this process, we will demolish imperialist domination, the domination of reaction. And we will wipe them off the face of the earth. We don't conceive of a worldwide People's War as an action that will take place simultaneously on a certain day and at a certain hour. We conceive of it as unfolding in the future and related to the 50 to 100 years that Chairman Mao Zedong predicted. We see it as great waves of People's War, until finally, all of them converge like the legions of steel of a great worldwide Red Army, as Lenin himself said. This is how we see it. We think this is the only road to follow. The problem, I insist, is that there is a risk of world war, and it would be a huge massacre, from which could only come misery, injustice, pain, and death, and more reasons to put an end to them. The only solution, therefore, is People's War, which, conceived of in waves, will lead to a worldwide People's War and the coming together of the legions of steel of the international proletariat, of the people, who, in the end, will carry out our historic mission. We have the great fortune to live in these decades in which imperialism and reaction will be swept away, because what Chairman Mao foresaw will be attained. If we do not see it ourselves, others who follow us will, because the legions are increasing more and more. What is the problem? What is the key? to place Marxism-Leninism-Maoism in command, and with Maoism principally, take up People's War, which is universally applicable, taking into account the character of each revolution and the specific conditions of each country.